Welcome to our next keynote in our Popularizing STEM conference. We're really happy that Stina Attebery joins us here today from California. She's actually a lecturer at the California Polytechnic State University, and she received her PhD from the University of California, Riverside back last year, I think 1.5 years ago at this point. Her research focuses on science and technology studies, eco-criticism, and media and game studies, with a particular focus on indigenous science and technology studies. She's currently working on 2 projects: Data Earth, Digital Animals in the Age of Extinction, which looks at the digital aesthetics of extinction art, and Refuse Ecologies, Indigenous Posthumanism in Polluted Futures. Parts of which, or the entire thing, is probably based on her dissertation, which you can actually read, which is available for free from the University Library System in California, if anyone wants to take an early look at what's probably going to become a great book. So as I was saying, we're really happy, Stina, that you've decided to join us here at our conference, and her talk will also draw on, I suppose, on her dissertation topic and book in progress, since it's titled Indigenous Science Fictions for a Polluted Future. Welcome, Stina, and thanks again.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here and get this tech difficulties part of this out of the way. There we go. I think that should work. And then, oh, actually, I'm going to make it so that I'm not looking at myself while I talk, because that's distracting for me. There we go. Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for this PopMech Association for inviting me. This is my first keynote, so I'm very excited about it. And this looks like a really fantastic conference. I wish I was able to attend more of the things. Today, I'd like to talk to you about an interest of mine, which is trash. And by that, I don't mean the parts of pop culture that we describe as trashy, although that is a part of the science fiction genre that I love dearly. Instead, I'm interested in the science fictionality of trash, how science fiction takes up trash and pollution as topics, and how trash can be technological and futuristic. So many of our technologies and our narratives about especially digital futures position technology as ephemeral, as invisible, as pure information without a material body. The language of cyberspace, the information age. There's a seeming immateriality to technology. Donna Haraway talks about this in her Cyborg Manifesto, this assumption of immateriality. It's one of the things that characterizes post-human life. She says that the boundary between physical and non-physical is very imprecise to us. Modern machines are quintessentially microelectronic devices. They are everywhere, they are invisible. Our best machines are made of sunshine, light, and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of a spectrum. And these portable devices do cause harm to people, but are distinguished from people because people are nowhere near so fluid, being material and opaque. And I think this is an interesting idea. Haraway mentions the harms and dangers of these sunshine machines, and I want to elaborate on that aspect. They are, in fact, much more than signals and much more than spectrums. Microelectronic devices create a huge amount of material waste. They are as material and opaque as bodies, despite what they seem. This opaqueness manifests in a couple of ways. Much of our technology is designed to become trash, to become obsolescent almost immediately, and to be discarded elsewhere, to landfills, often landfills in other countries. And this is deliberate. I'm very much struck by a phrase that I read in the book, Pollution is Colonialism, which I'll be citing later, in which an editor for the magazine Modern Packaging in the 1950s said, "The future of plastics is in the trash can." And that's an attitude that's emulated by a lot of industries. The future of trash and waste, both future capital and future material, is trash. This rhetoric of waste as the future of technology also applies beyond plastics, beyond and before the visible material waste products of discarded devices in landfills. The creation of new technological devices comes with an environmental cost. Things like the extractive colonialism of bitumen mining in the Republic of the Congo, or the disturbing fact that 99% of the materials involved in making microchips and semiconductors is discarded. as shards of raw matter, as chemicals, as wastewater. Places like Silicon Valley, bastions of the tech industries, are also incredibly polluted. So far, I'm framing this as a technical problem, a problem with STEM, with industry and late capitalism more specifically, but these issues are also central to our imagination of what the future looks like. And I'm interested in how this future trash gets picked up in science fiction. When does it get represented, when it doesn't, and which science fiction stories allow us the space to rethink our relationship to technological waste. I'll be looking at a range of examples in this talk, from early cyberpunk to a specific Matisse cyberpunk novel called Red Spider White Web, and then ending with the trash planet Sakaar from Thor Ragnarok. And along the way, I'll consider how Indigenous science fiction texts imagine a trashed future very differently from mainstream and Western SF, and introduce you to some Indigenous research methodologies that I see particularly useful for thinking about STEM and popular culture. So even Evan Calder-Williams argues in The Combined and Uneven Apocalypse that another world is necessary, but only built from the gutted hull of this one. For Williams, this other world is built using salvage or salvage punk, the post-apocalyptic vision of a broken and dead world, strewn with both the dream residues and real junk of the world that was, and shot through with the hard work of salvaging, repurposing, scrapping. So what does this trashed and gutted future look like? Imagining the future of trash is an important part of grappling with life in the Anthropocene. And I've increasingly seen landfills, pollutants, other forms of tech waste as part of the background or world building in science fiction. I suspect that this ubiquity of trash is part of what Mark Gould calls the Anthropocene unconscious. Although this is a speculative citation on my part, his book just came out and my copy hasn't arrived yet. So I'm citing him here as Mark Gould brackets probably. Nevertheless, I see Gould's reading of trash and salvage in an Ethiopian post-apocalyptic film called Crumbs, which I saw him present a few years ago, was really helpful for me in the early thinking of this project. And Crumbs is one of several interesting examples of explicitly anti-colonial futurist works set in trashed worlds. The Kenyan film Pumzi is another good example, or the recent Chinese science fiction novel, The Waste Tide, which is all about e-waste. But science fiction trash worlds are also increasingly mainstream. If even Disney is making stories about salvaging a post-apocalyptic trash planet, like the dystopia for children that is WALL-E, then clearly the mere presence of trash in a science fiction world is not enough to question and unpack the connections between trash and the extractive capitalist and colonialist practices which Disney is famous for. And I'm of two minds here about WALL-E as a text here. For the first 20 minutes or so, it's a really interesting look at a truly post-human salvage punk world. It's all about the hard work of salvaging culture and objects, but the need to make it hopeful and optimistic, to say at the end that it's fine now because we have a single plant in a boot, which is all you need to restart an ecology, I think really undercuts what's interesting about the early sections of this movie. Which brings me back to the seeming immateriality of digital technologies, because the idea that technology is ephemeral itself and makes us ephemeral by using it, that it is nothing but signals, is central to a lot of science fiction, and plays out in complicated ways alongside this imagery of post-apocalyptic waste. There are strange overlaps between salvage punk and cyberpunk that I'm going to tease out here. Cyberpunk is in many ways the quintessential example of science fiction which thinks about digital technologies alongside waste. This plays out most clearly in the distinction between cyberspace and meat space. Cyberpunks disconnect from their bodies and environments to enter digital worlds where they can actually become signal, become information. The problems with this escape from the body are numerous and have been written about a lot, going all the way back to Anne Catherine Hales. So what interests me here is, about cyberpunk as an example, is meat space itself. For many cyberpunk texts, the reason characters are so eager to escape into virtuality is that their world is polluted. Meat space is filled with the material harms of a hyper-capitalist future, and that includes trash. The meat here is toxic. Sometimes this is a background element. The opening line of Neuromancer, for instance, the sky above the port was the color of a television tuned to a dead channel, which draws attention to the deathly polluted air quality of the world, as much as it's a kind of statement about media saturation. A sky this color is not a healthy sky. Or in Blade Runner 2049, which has a similarly grayish, brownish film tint to communicate pollution, and includes plot points like Ryan Gosling's character visiting a landfill where people are living and working and scrapping. These elements are not what the story is about, but they help inform the world and the characters. Even The Matrix, with its fully simulated world, draws attention to the meaty materiality of bodies. Using humans as batteries doesn't make any logical sense, but it does communicate the material presence and harms of some of these technologies, especially since bodies become as disposable as batteries or machines, as disposable as our current digital devices. And I can't believe I'm defending the human batteries part of The Matrix, but I am. Often cyberpunk comments directly on environmental destruction as well. The mass extinction event of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or Raphael Carter's novel The Fortunate Fall, or characters like Jonesy the Dolphin from Johnny Mnemonic, all use animals and environments to comment on capitalism, on the militarization of technology, on other topics. Jonesy is a good example here, because as a cyborg dolphin, he can directly speak back to the humans who are implicitly or explicitly responsible for his damaged ocean environment. And especially in the 80s and 90s, his dolphinness is important. It's an important shorthand for a kind of joyfully beautiful ecology that is either free from or harmed by human influence. That's characteristic of both like the 1995 Save the Dolphins campaign, or as I've indicated here, other media at the time. My point here is that there are reasons to escape the body in cyberpunk. Meat space is trashed and polluted, so virtual world becomes more compelling. As we live in a cyberpunk world right now, I think this is an understandable desire. Even when we want to see our trash in science fiction, we want it filtered through the cute computer-generated imagery of WALL-E. The disgusting, polluted materiality of meat space has a purpose in these texts. But there's also a limitation here. Cyberpunk and other digital-oriented forms of science fiction present a world where there's kind of nothing to do about this. There's nowhere to go other than doubling down on cyberspace as a space of disembodied escape. And it's interesting to see how this distinction between meat and cyberspace plays out in recent cyberpunk texts, as cyberpunk becomes kind of more of an aesthetic than anything. I think Ready Player One is the best example of this, which retains the cyberspace elements of the genre without even the veneer of ecological commentary. The planet has been ruined in the novel and the movie, but it's kind of taken for granted that that would be the case. It's not even a generator of new pathos. Meat space has entirely receded into the background. So, which forms of science fiction can escape this problem, can draw attention to the meat of meat space, to the materiality of trash, without desiring an escape from our polluted world, especially when the proliferation of digital technologies and of virtual spaces is a major contributing factor to our current trash-filled world. Escape makes the problem worse. Well, I see this work happening across a number of ecologically minded science fictions. Queer and feminist work, Afrofuturist and other forms of alternative futurisms. Texts engaging with these perspectives tend to take on more oppositional and anti-colonial approaches. Especially useful here for my purposes is Indigenous science fictions and Indigenous methodologies, since these are texts and concepts that are always engaged with land. Indigenous isn't an identity marker in the same way that most racial identity markers operate. Instead, it refers to a traditional, collaborative and inventive relationship to land, a relationship that is very grounded. So identity is not as much of a concept in Indigenous theory as sovereignty, the ability to access and govern traditional lands. For this talk, I'm going to be engaging primarily with 3 Indigenous theory books, which I think are really great, although I will mention some other texts along the way. Métis scholar Max Liboiron's book Pollution is Colonialism, Australian settler scholar Elizabeth Pavanelli's Geontologies, and Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon's collection Walking the Clouds. But engaging with these books involves more than just citing them. There are particular methodologies used in Indigenous theory which I need to engage with, especially since I'm a white settler scholar. This is going to be my methods part of the talk. So 3 Indigenous methodologies, among many. First, acknowledgements and obligations. A land acknowledgement is kind of a common practice in conference spaces, especially right now in the US and Canada. For instance, I'm situated on Cahuilla and Tongva land, where I currently am in Southern California. So my presence here is engaging with a particular situated history of California Native nations. And as you've seen already, I also acknowledge the specific Indigenous communities that different scholars are part of, like introducing Grace Dillon as Anishinaabe. And I do my best to engage with the specific words and terms that they use, especially when these terms are coming out of native languages. But in terms of a land acknowledgement, I'm also talking to you across a vast distance. And if you're watching the recorded version, across time, so hello from the past. These distances are breached by the material technologies of the internet, which also have a material presence on and across native land, and which are central to these networks of extraction and waste that I've outlined. But I need to do more here than just acknowledge that these networks exist. A land acknowledgement should be more than just another type of academic acknowledgement. It's more than just saying thank you, because understanding where I am comes with obligations to the peoples with a present and future relationship to this land. So this is why resources like the Land Reparations and Indigenous Solidarity Toolkit can be useful. Words like decolonization and sovereignty aren't metaphors or buzzwords that I can just slot into my academic research. They're a set of material practices and obligations that I take on by doing this work. I've also found Liboiron's work really useful for thinking about these obligations in the particular context of pollution. As they point out, pollution is colonialism. Trash is how our technological present colonizes the future. And understanding that should change how we approach environmental justice because, quote, these colonial relations, these assumptions about access to native land are reproduced through even well-intentioned environmental science and activism. Second, non-extractive reading and citation. Liboiron's work also led me to a Twitter thread by Unagak scholar Eve Tuck, which talks about extractive reading. This is only part of it. To watch the white settlers sift through our work as they ask, isn't there more for me here? Isn't there more for me to get out of this? Isn't there something less theoretical, something more theoretical, something more practical, something less radical, more possible? I'll just keep sifting through all this work that was never meant for me, sorting it by what's useful to me and what's discardable. And as Eve Tuck comments, she forgets that people read extractively for discovery. This is a really challenging idea. Most of academia is set up so that we read extractively and discard the rest, mining an article for the useful quote and then skimming a bunch of it. I do this. I've done this a lot in the past. But Liboiron suggests that there are several ways to read and cite relationally instead of extractively. They suggest approaching texts as bodies of work, as events, as gifts, as teachers, as letters, changing the metaphorical relationship we have to a source. They suggest citing at length, letting the scholar's words sit in the context of their own argument, signaling how readings are in relation to each other, using humor or informal footnotes to engage a reader differently, and just taking the time to read and reread somebody's work, especially if you aren't citing it for your own projects. I'm still practicing how to do this. I have very little time to just sit down and read theory, but I think it's a really useful method, all of these, for resisting the extractive and exploitative parts of academia. Finally, I need to think about suspending damage. This is a term that also comes from Eve Tuck's work in an essay by the same name. Too often, academic research about marginalized peoples are damage-based. They focus on the violence and harm these communities live with. This is especially important if I'm looking at pollution and trash, which do tremendous amounts of damage. Métis scholar Michelle Murphy talks about this when talking about decolonial chemical relations. As she says, technoscientific research that seeks to contest the presence of synthetic chemicals in the world tends to proceed by detecting and measuring the damage chemicals done to bodies. And despite having anti-racist intentions, doing damage-based research in this way has pernicious effects. It focuses on the violence and renders lives and landscapes as pathological. It resuscitates racist, misogynist, and homophobic portraits of these peoples as damaged, as doomed already, as inhabiting irreparable states that are not just unwanted, but less than fully human. So there are ethical considerations to which texts I choose when thinking about pollution in science fiction and how I talk about them. In many ways, it's easier to suspend damage when working on science fiction than it would be if I was in another field. Indigenous futurisms are often post-apocalyptic, but never doomed. One word for this is survivance, a term that Anishinaabe scholar and author Gerald Visner uses. It combines survival and resistance, survivance, and suggests that you need both in order to avoid representing Indigenous peoples as tragic, doomed, trapped in an apocalyptic past. Another approach is Grace Dillon's, who is in conversation with Visner. She talks about Biskabayang, an Anishinaabe word connoting the process of returning to ourselves, which involves discovering how one is personally affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt to our post-native apocalypse world. So it's apocalyptic, but also forward-looking. According to Dillon, even when Indigenous science fiction is apocalyptic, there's a purpose to and a future created despite this apocalypse. Things can be grim, but they're not doomed. In the context of polluted futures, I'm interested in the ways that Biskabayang fits with something Elizabeth Pavanelli talks about, toxic sovereignty, or toxic survivance, a form of survivance in which survival does not quite fit into the picture, where Indigenous sovereignty over space is re-emerging in the space of utter state abandonment and total capital despoilment, safely emerging in the corrupted and corroded areas of late liberal capital and governance. And Pavanelli has a number of very interesting examples of sovereignty being carved out in specifically toxic and polluted and unlivable spaces. So toxic sovereignty brings up a number of questions for me. What does it mean to have survivance without survival? When are spaces and peoples rendered governable through becoming pollutable? And when are they able to leverage pollution to become ungovernable, to become illegible within those systems, to suspend damage? So I'm interested in not just toxic sovereignty, but toxic Biskabayang, when returning to ourselves takes place on lands and in communities that are already polluted. All of this brings me to Red Spider White Web, which is a cyberpunk novel published in 1990 at the height of the cyberpunk movement by a Métis writer named Misha Noga, who typically just goes by Misha, so that's what I'm going to call her. She publishes under that name. Misha is really interested in the meat of meat space, not just as an abject space for pollution, but as a place where toxic forms of survivance, sovereignty, and Biskabayang can form. She approaches technology, especially the disembodied technologies of cybernetics and informatics, which characterize most cyberpunk fiction, in very different ways. As Cheryl Vint points out in a chapter, the mainstream finds its own uses for things, cyberpunk and commodification, quote, in contrast to the console cowboys' faux estrangement from power, Misha's characters live in an impoverished and bleak world. And more importantly, a world in which previously uncommodified areas of experience are disappearing. And significant to this bleakness is that the world is trash. It's pollution. There's pollution and trash everywhere. It permeates the entire environment. So the characters in this world are not just alienated by the commodification and dystopian capitalist domination of their world, typical cyberpunk things, they're also environmentally ill. They're disabled by pollutants and toxins. If you're not familiar with this book, and I'm assuming you're not, it's hard to find, it's often out of print, it's very obscure, although it's getting more critical attention now, which is much deserved. The novel imagines a dystopian city where society is divided between contained corporate dome cities run by the future corporation Mickey-san, which is clearly meant to be Disney, and dead tech, the polluted outskirts of the city, which is inhabited by a bizarre collection of gangs, cannibals, cultists, artists. The art community is the focus of the novel, as different characters incorporate trash and discarded technologies into their work and lives in this polluted outskirts of the city. The stakes of living in dead tech become more fraught as these artists find themselves the targets of a deranged serial killer, whose murders are kind of scattered throughout the novel in point of view serial killer vignettes. But the narrative mostly follows three point of view characters. Mottler, a bioartist who sells out to live in the Mickey-san dome and has a hilariously upsetting time there. Tommy, a cyborg who collects hacked surveillance drones and robots made from repurposed wire, wood, plastic, and chrome. And most importantly, Kumo, a genetic hybrid, part human and part Wolverine, who creates holographic art shows of extinct animals. Kumo and Tommy are both Métis, and they both work as salvagers and artists. They leverage trash technologies against what Tommy calls the effluent affluent of the corporate consumer culture. So salvage, art, and repurposed tech all become strategies for these characters to play with the toxicity of their environment. And the world of Red Spider White Web is teeming with refuse. The novel begins with Tommy posed kind of Batman-like overlooking the city, describing chemicals and effluent and plastic and paper and dust and trash and sulfur wind and acid rain. Elsewhere, the city is described as spashy, soshing smelt. So Misha uses a lot of very poetic descriptions to create a viscerally unsettling environment. These disgusting descriptions link environmental refuse to the bodies of the characters. The descriptions of waste are not of a distant slag heap observed from a position of safety. This isn't Ryan Gosling visiting a dump in Blade Runner 2049 before returning safely to Alexa, his virtual girlfriend / assistant. Instead, waste permeates the bodies of these characters. It's inescapable. Kumo's introduction pushes these associations between trash and pollution and the body even further. She wakes in an abandoned boxcar that she's been using as a shelter, and the novel spends several pages describing just the secretions and vulnerabilities of her body. She has goggled eyes crusted with sleep. Her first act upon waking is to blow her nose. She pulls down a mask only to scrub at her face with alcohol, and this perfunctory cleaning ritual stings in the cuts in her face and lips. So she takes stock of her body's pains, assessing the risks and the wounds limb by limb, and then she's shivering and drenched in sweat. So the reader first learns about Kumo through her wounds, through the ways her body has been harmed by the world around her and excretes itself out into that world. And these descriptions of Kumo's ill and damaged body are important because they demonstrate how her body has been rendered pollutable in the same way that her land has been. It reflects the geontopolitics and geopolitics of toxic sovereignty. Kumo's assessment of her bodily vulnerability also extends into the world around her. She exits the boxcar into a city shrouded in brown smog. She experiences this smoggy morning internally as well as externally. The river mist licked the calcium straight from her bones. And she continues to excrete parts of herself. She spits and pisses into a pail. She laughs to herself as she warms her shivering body with the exertion of a croupy cough. Everything about her introduction emphasizes that Kumo is ill and that her illness is the consequence of her toxic environment, but also links her to her toxic environment. From the first pages of this introduction, she's defined by her biological vulnerability and the vulnerability of her land. They become almost the same thing. Despite these grim experiences, Red Spider White Web presents Kumo as someone who rejects victimhood in favor of survivance. When she's attacked by a gang, which is another grim part of her morning routine, she weaponizes her own effluence by flinging her pail of shit and piss at the gang leader, by vomiting on them. It's an incredibly gross scene. So she weaponizes her toxic body. This is toxic survivance in which survival is not the only motivator. And this extends to other weird intimacies between her body and her environment. Even though she's physically vulnerable in her toxic world, she protects herself with layers of masks and a suit made from living shark clone skin, bristling with tentacles yet supple enough to stretch in, and patterned and molded to the shape of exposed muscle tissue. Removing her mask is something that Kumo describes as like skinning a cat, a form of exposure. So all of these descriptions play with the folding of sickness inside and outside the body. Kumo's salvaged post-human medical devices do protect her from the pollution in her environment, but they also expose macabre reflections of her body in her sharkskin's design of exposed muscles, in her masks, which is a series of kind of Wolverine layers. This reversal of inside and outside reveals the ways toxicity invisibly crosses boundaries. It turns into a kind of performance of identity in the way that identity says something about land. So it's kind of tying her to a network of obligations and non-human species relationships, which then becomes part of her holographic art. When Kumo makes holograms out of salvaged technology, her designs are often extinct animals that she saw once. There's a sense of ongoing obligation and connection to even missing and digitally rendered species. So I see Kumo's use of trash and pollutants in her art and in her body as belligerently anti-capitalist forms of cyborg identity. Kumo gleefully eats synthetic sushi. She breathes in the radiant poison of the toxic air. She bathes in the gluey water of chemical takes. So she takes what's thrown at her, salvaged trash and chemical waste, and transforms these materials. They become part of her simulacra art and her post-human body. She deliberately incorporates the refuse from her land into her body to not just survive in this apocalyptic wasteland, but to enact a kind of toxic survivance. This kind of toxic survivance or toxic Biscabiang isn't just happening in obscure novels from 1990, though. Despite being another Disney production and part of the Marvel franchise juggernaut, Thor Ragnarok thinks about the ethics of trash in a similarly anti-colonial way, something I would credit mostly to Maori filmmaker Taika Waititi and the ways he tried to incorporate Indigenous ideas and creators both in front of and behind the camera when making the movie. The making of Thor Ragnarok is really fascinating. So Thor Ragnarok departs from previous Thor movies pretty significantly because it actively explores the planet and politics of Asgard and exposes Asgard's colonial past. Thor has to come to terms with the fact that his people violently colonized the rest of the 9 realms, extracted resources and wealth, and then promptly pretended none of that had ever happened. What seemed initially to be a utopian space paradise is actually built on violent colonial foundations. And I mean that literally. Underneath the throne room, there are hundreds of undead warriors who are resurrected along with the buried truths of this colonial past. It's not a subtle movie. By exploring Asgard's ongoing colonialism, the film shifts the titular Ragnarok backwards in time. If Ragnarok is the ongoing and often unnoticed apocalypses of colonialism, then this film is post-apocalyptic. Just not post-apocalyptic for the Asgardians yet, but for everybody that they colonized. And I think it's important that this exploration of identity, privilege, and space colonialism largely takes place away from Asgard itself, on the planet Sakaar, a world constantly bombarded with trash from the rest of the universe that spews out onto the surface in a series of wormholes ringing the planet. Sakaar is a world built around salvaging together identity, collaborating with other oppressed peoples, and seeking liberation, mostly from Jeff Goldblum, even while living in an apocalyptic ruins. In the design and aesthetics of the film, the trash on Sakaar is salvaged to create indigenous futures. And we can see this salvaged trash most clearly in some of the design choices, especially the spaceship designs. The character Valkyrie has a ship that we first see as kind of junky and falling apart. It's clearly built from the trash in the environment, because how else do you build a spaceship on Sakaar? But the ship is designed after the Tino Renga Tiratanga flag, the Maori flag. You can see the color and patterns match up with the flag in the corner here. Even though Valkyrie is, at this point, also kind of jaded at falling apart, the ship she has salvaged and that she uses in her work as a salvager connects that piecing together of identity in a world of trash to cultural resurgence. It's building and maintaining a ship for her that is kind of a technological form of survivance as well as survival. And then at the end of the film, Valkyrie has reconnected with her past. She has returned to herself, understanding the ways she has been impacted by colonialism, which as a Black actress playing an Asgardian is complex, and seeking out a better future. Fireworks go off behind her. She walks out of a ship designed after the Australian Aboriginal flag this time. She's on a rainbow road. It's hard to think of a more jubilant image of Indigenous futurisms than this. The ending of the film is also really important. Thor's choice to allow Asgard to be destroyed transforms the Asgardians into a diasporic spacefaring race. They are no longer profiting for their ongoing colonial control over the 9 realms. It's a very dramatic way to do a kind of land-back politics. Instead, they must live alongside disenfranchised aliens like the character Korg, played by Taika Waititi. And I think it's fair to see Korg as more than just a comic relief character. He's aligned with a Maori sensibility, a sense of humor and politics. These transformations turn Ragnarok into a hopeful apocalypse. And I'm pretending for the purposes of this argument that there are no other Marvel movies after Thor Ragnarok, because the stuff after that kind of undercut all of the interesting stuff this movie did. But this one movie does set up interesting possibilities for a decolonized future, where Thor can stand with and uphold his obligations to other peoples. The parts of Thor Ragnarok that are set on Sakaar are, after all, about a revolution. And this revolution promises to build a better world out of the trashed remains of this one. So in both of these Indigenous science fictions, I see the material presence of technology and trash as grounds for survival, for survivance, for sovereignty, and for cultural resilience. These pop culture texts draw our attention to the invisible and often overlooked materiality of trash, and offer somewhere to go, whether that's a decolonized Earth, the polluted art community of dead tech, or a diasporic cosmos. So thank you.
Thanks a ton, Stina, for that really intriguing talk, and also this twist reading in a certain way of Thor Ragnarok. Reading an Indigenous futurism into that is intriguing, but as you were saying, depends very much on ignoring the rest of the films afterwards.
Which I very much do anyway. So.
Yeah. Are there any questions before I possibly take over? Okay, no quick ones. I especially found your sort of meta commentary in a certain way on this sort of extractive reading really intriguing, in terms of, because it, at the end of the day, you become confronted with things, as you were also saying, what you're doing as a scholar all the time, especially, and this has been a sort of problem of mine on a number of levels as well, this sort of extractive reading, especially, again, as you were kind of pointing out, of as a white scholar, of people of color, and how you pick their brains in a certain way, and hence in some way or another arguably often then engage in the very same colonialist performances in a certain way that they try to critique, and you kind of critique it as well, but at the same time you perform them. Is this sort of, as you were saying, with sort of drawing on these Indigenous writers, and also in terms of Owen scholars, and acknowledging the fact that you do, of course, perform the extractive readings, is this, I don't know, is this enough? I'm not, yeah, I know it's a huge question. So the question is, probably, how can you authentically, for the lack of a better word, engage with ethnic scholarship and ethnic, of course, lumping it all together now, primary texts, novels, and so on, from a white perspective as a settler colonialist scholar?
Yeah, I think in some ways it is impossible to do it fully ethically, to do that kind of work fully authentically. But in many ways, I'm really invested in inauthentic futures anyway, in the forms of in Indigenous characters that are living in polluted conditions and are belligerent and weird and strange, in people who have no real investment in authenticity or have a kind of strange investment in it. And to the extent that the questions around extractive reading practices and discarded reading practices are aligning with some of my work on extraction and discard, like I think I will always get it wrong in some ways, but acknowledging that as part of the acknowledgement is important. I am never going to be the perfect introduction to Indigenous futurisms. I think I said that when you guys invited me to give this keynote, that like, I can, but I'm not the person. I'm going to direct you towards others who are doing this work in ways that I find really compelling. But yeah, there's no way of doing it perfectly, and the people who claim to do it perfectly are wrong and are obscuring their own kind of abuses within academia usually. So dwelling in the place of imperfect allyship is, I think, the best that we can do. In addition to things like monetarily actually helping, supporting land back movements, there are kind of practical things to do as well. It's a material practice.
Yes, right. Yeah, also the more activist scholarship that goes along with that, with actual actions, as a matter of fact, not just the performances of actions in a certain way that coming from continental Europe, I think that where it's even more glaring than in the US, but different topic. The other thing that struck me, even though you sort of, I feel like you only touched on it briefly, there was a moment where your other main larger project came in a certain way with the digital animals, while we were talking about the novel. So I was wondering, on a more general level, potentially even, the sort of this recreation or collection of extinct species, whether that might play a larger role in the text you've looked at recently, either from an indigenous futurist perspective or more generally in your other project, in how what sort of role it plays.
Yeah, I've been thinking about extinct species and digital representations of animals off and on for the past, like 8 years or so. So it's something that often, I think, crops up in my work, usually in passing. I think one of the texts that I use to think with this problem the most is not an Indigenous text, but is Ted Chiang's novella, The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which is part of his Exhalations collection, I believe now. It used to be out of print, which is really great. But one of the things that I see that novella doing is that it points out that digital spaces are becoming obsolete more quickly than extinct animals are becoming extinct. So I'm interested in the ways that representations of animals in kind of digital spaces, art about extinct animals, sort of CGI renders of extinct animals, are drawing attention to the intense precarity of biological environments because our technology is so precarious, so much more precarious, that there's a kind of extinction event happening all the time around digital devices. And if we make animals in that form, we're not memorializing them. We're kind of rendering them in terms that become more precarious, but that there's something kind of productive there. So this is something that I'm working through still, but that's kind of how I approach it. And I do see Kumo doing that a bit in her art, that the animals have there's a continuing sense of obligation to an extinct species through art that is really interesting. More about the activism and how it can intertwine with academic work. I mean, that's a tricky thing to do because it takes different forms at different times, and it's so difficult to do under the conditions that I'm currently working under, because I'm a I'm an adjunct and I'm teaching 5 classes. But I think to the extent to which I have money, trying to give money, especially aligning with publications that come out, or aligning with talks that I give, or especially aligning with anything that gives me money. Like I think I was paid a tiny amount of money for a LARB review a few years back and then donated that money immediately. So that's a material practice. I'm so disconnected as an adjunct from the campuses and spaces that I actually live and work that it's very difficult, but I'm hoping to be able to do more of that once I have a more stable location. But it often involves seeing what's already there, like assuming you're going to invent the wheel in terms of Indigenous activist support in academic spaces is usually wrong. There's always somebody doing that work already, but finding ways to support them. And also supporting scholars. Like activism doesn't just involve the community in a kind of non-academic way, because scholars are also part of a community.
Since sort of Anna jumped in between, the thing that you mentioned about the extinct species before reminded me of, I don't know whether you read it, Antoine Tresnel, I guess, recent book on capture, where he concludes on with a note on, you know, the sort of the journey that the passenger pigeon took from being captured at first, being killed and eradicated, of course, then being captured in a zoo. And then now, apparently, recently there was, in some US museum, there was some sort of digital hologram. I've heard that there is this sort of notion that, you know, it basically becomes extinct again in a certain way. It already anticipates its future extinction by the very fact that it's, on the one hand, just a temporary exhibit, but then also the sort of notion that, you know, this digital space will disappear in a certain way.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, there are weird overlaps between kind of studies around museums and preserves and things like that, and the digital spaces. They very much kind of allied.
Right. So Anna follows up on the Indigenous activism question. How do Indigenous activists and communities in general react to non-Indigenous academic work on their communities?
I mean, variously and complexly. Grace Dillon has been hugely welcoming to people who are white scholars doing work on Indigenous science fiction, and has been a huge, wonderful mentor for a lot of us who are doing this kind of work. In other fields, it's a little bit more tense. I've seen it done very badly in certain kinds of conference spaces, and I've seen it done very well. So there's never just one reaction to it, and navigating that is challenging, but it should be challenging. So I don't know if I have an easy answer to that. Within science fiction, it's been very welcoming, and because Indigenous science fiction is coming out of so many different communities around the world, there's a sense of kind of like moving across different locations in order to think about the shared connection of Indigenous futurism, so connections across Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism. One of the terms that's come up recently is co-futures, thinking about connections across these different spaces. So it's a really like vibrant and welcoming part of science fiction scholarship right now.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a field in which you get a little bit more, I don't know if it's because it's quite diverse or a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more open to other approaches, I think, science fiction, futurisms, and these kind of things. But I do think that it really depends. I work on Mexican and Chicanic studies, and it really depends on how they see you, how you approach them as well. Because of course there are some people that will always be, no, you're so white, you cannot do this. But I think that in other cases, it's really, it really depends on the humility you approach them with. If they see that you want to learn, and in my experience, I think as well, it's about a kind of knowledge that is not academic knowledge about their communities, that it's more like you know, small things of everyday life, and they recognize, they acknowledge that you know them, so they feel that you're kind of like a little bit part of their community in a way, if it makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's interesting how you were saying that sometimes, yes, it's very open, some other times it's a little bit more hostile, and for many reasons, I guess.
Yeah, and it's both valuable to have a kind of connection to a community, but a problem to assume that you should have that connection because they might not want you there. I don't really do like ethnographic research at all, so the community that I'm interacting with is like, oh, I've met this author, you know, the kind of typical way that kind of happens. But that's also a part of the community, and yeah, navigating that is always different in different contexts.
Yeah, I think it's very positive, even just talking to the author, because like really talking, just, you know, interviewing them, trying to show that you have interest for real, not just, you know, I need to read a paper, to write a paper, and I'm gonna write about your book, right? So there is some kind of conversation. And I found that that's very enriching in a way, because they do tell you about the work, how important it is. So I guess even just talking with the author, somehow you can touch on those things.
Yeah, I think if you work on pop culture, we have the strange benefit of working on living authors and living media makers, and that creates a different kind of relationship sometimes, which is really interesting. Yeah. Oh, was I going to say something else? I think I've lost my train of thought.
Thank you. I think we have another.
Right, I was going to say there is one question from the audience. Jenny, sorry, last name, Bouvier.
Yeah, sure. No, and any pronunciation is fine. I just wanted to start by just saying thank you for such an extremely interesting talk. I never thought so much about trash in my life, I think, and never so productively. So thank you. I guess this is sort of more sort of asking if you have a little bit to say about something that struck me rather than a specific question, because I've been working on trans-species kinship and thinking about societies in terms of, I've used different terms, but hominid ecologies, but the whole sort of idea of thinking about our societies as ecologies, where you know, biological life is sort of yeah, it's discussed as biological life. And I really liked thinking about trash in connection with that, because you wouldn't think about ecologies generally as generating trash, right? It's not, I mean, I've read quite a bit on, you know, people sort of rethinking human life in terms of seeing it as sort of crossing the nature culture divide, basically. And trash doesn't quite seem to fit into that paradigm to me. So what I started thinking about when you were talking about trash. So I guess my sort of what I'd like to hear you say a little bit about, if you could, is sort of how do we is trash, does trash sort of bring us to the post-apocalypse, or is there sort of can we sort of, how do we deal with trash in these kinds of attempts of trying to reimagine ways of living that wouldn't be as hostile to our planet, so to speak? Because it seems like trash takes us to the post-apocalypse as something that is already happening or that is there. And I don't know if I'm making sense, but these are just the kind of thoughts I had when you were talking, and I would love to hear you say something about that.
Thank you for that question. I think one of the things that understanding pollution as colonialism does is it very much shifts the apocalypse backwards, in the way that like Ragnarok is a past event now rather than a future one. which is very much how a lot of Indigenous thinkers and writers talk about the apocalypse in Indigenous science fiction, or Indigenous lived experience, that it's already happened, and that pollution is part of that. So we are always living in a post-apocalyptic world, and we have since colonization started. So texts that kind of engage with that have a different kind of, a different sense of futurity to them, because they do have a sense of futurity to them, which is very strange. So I'm all in favor of like cleaning up the oceans more than they've been cleaned up, and like not just continuing to trash our planet. But at the same time, we have to kind of grapple with the fact that we live in a trashed planet, and where ecology now involves man-made objects. I'm really fascinated by things like the plasticlomerate, the rocks found on the beach in Hawaii that are part plastic, that's now part of our fossil record, but is also part of our lived ecology. Those rocks are part of an ecosystem. And that's true of a lot of different spaces. So I think some of the texts that I've looked at as part of this larger project involve like making media that incorporates toxic matter as part of a world. So something like Elizabeth LaPensay's video game Thunderbird Strike, which includes tires in the background, as well as like captures of like natural elements like shells, or Warren Cario's petrographs, which makes photographs out of bitumen, like extract, or yes, that's correct. I'm forgetting words. So like drawing attention through media making to the fact that these elements are already part of our ecology, and that when we use a word like ecology, we have to grapple with the fact that that's there. Yeah. But not in a hopeless way.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks. Thank you so much.
You're muted.
Yeah, I noticed. I clicked it, but it didn't go on for some reason. Unless, I mean, officially we have reached the end of our session time-wise. Is there maybe a final question? But since there was not that much, doesn't seem to be the case. No.
Oh, if anybody wants to read my Thunderbird Strike article, send me an email and I will send it to you as a PDF, because I don't know that it's always accessible to people.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Thanks again for your great talk, and as you heard, it inspired, I guess, more than just Jenny in terms of responding and thinking more, as you were saying, about waste at the end of the day. Even though, as you also pointed out, it's of course a sort of omnipresent topic in our world today, and it will remain an omnipresent topic for a future that might not be human anymore. On that very positive note, thanks again for this inspiring talk, Stina. I guess thanks to the audience, our second day has thus also come to an end.